So the background is that we received a letter from the governor letting us know that they want us to plan for a state school fund amount of between 5.9 to 5.4 billion, which means that they're asking us to build a budget that could be between $30 to $50 million short. That's a heck of a range to aim for. So what we're doing here is we're going to model after we did the bond process of moving information out through the community and getting feedback before we make the final recommendation on balancing the budget. And so by the time I actually do the budget presentation, hopefully we'll have a much better informed community and that they will be able to draw their opinions on facts that we more agree on rather than on perceptions of facts. The purpose of the presentation is to give you some information about revenue, and we'd also like to begin gathering reactions to potential budget proposals. I want to remind you that we are staying focused on the values of the organization as we go through these extremely tough times around the budget building process. We want to minimize any negative impact on students. We want to provide as much security for employees as we can. We want to be able to save and preserve jobs as much as possible. We definitely need to consider how we're positioning ourselves as a school district for future years. This is not an 09-10 problem. This is a problem that we need to be preparing for over the next 2 to 3 years, as it will take a while for the negative economy that we're in to turn around and then to have the security come back to our public education system. It's also really important to us in this particular budget process that we use communications and dialogue with each other to build more strength and to move us closer together. I think the bond election was a very important time in our community to say that when we inform everyone and we actually give them the ability to provide feedback for us, we got an approval rating of 58% yes vote. And we'd like to mirror and strengthen that even higher for this particular process. I'll state some things that may feel fairly obvious, but we are definitely in not only a local, but a national, international crisis around our economy, and that will be affected, that will have an effect on all of us. That will not be specific to public entities and not have an impact on private. It is definitely touching all of our lives. Unfortunately in Oregon, because we have struggled with funding for public entities and specifically public education in this conversation, we don't always have the same awareness around the education problems. And a recent poll is showing us that still about 50% of Oregonians do not believe that there is a budget crisis or they're not aware of it. And yet our unemployment rate is the worst it's been since the early 80s. The report, I think it was Monday, came out and said it's over 12%, and it's been growing at an alarming rate. We've already felt the impact this year. Keep in mind that we balanced this year's budget by cutting $8.3 million from our current spending plan, and that included not only stopping a lot of purchases that we were planning on doing in technology, in textbooks. It also included a freeze on hiring of non-essential positions, and we used a significant amount of reserves or ending fund balance. Just a quick comment about ending fund balance. It's an important concept, and sometimes it's difficult to get people to understand it. Ending fund balance is a little bit like you have a spending plan for your month, and you know a certain prediction of revenue you're going to get, and hopefully when you get to the end of the month, you have some money left in your checking account, and you're counting on that money that's left to shore up your next month's spending. Okay? So it's a little bit like that concept. So businesses always want to have an ending fund balance. We can't take it down to zero because we need it to get the next year started. However, we have had a healthy ending fund balance, which is a good thing because it's going to help us out in balancing this year and preparing for next year. But we are spending it down. So the balancing of this year's plan required us to spend down the ending fund balance by $4.5 million. The legislature is in session, so we are not, we do not know yet what our funding shortfall will be, but we do have to have legally a budget adopted by June 30th. So we must move through our spending plan conversation with the community, even though we don't have a revenue projection yet from our state legislature. We do know that the legislature has some ability to shore up Oregon's problems, either with federal stimulus money or with the Education Stability Fund or the Rainy Day Fund. We won't have another revenue forecast until May, and that is likely to be very bad news when we get that revenue forecast in May. We are hopeful that the governor and the legislature will not ask school districts to make cuts as late as May for this year because they recognize that that would mean some pretty devastating impact on students. We're hopeful that we'll get through this year with just the $8.3 million in cuts that I already mentioned. Okay, so let's talk about next year. The governor did send out a letter as well as the state superintendent, Susan Castillo, asking districts to plan for multiple scenarios, and that would be a range between $5.4 to $5.9 billion to be spent in the state of Oregon for education. What that translates to us is a shortfall or cuts that would range anywhere from $30 to $50 million. Just to give you some perspective on that, our whole general fund budget is $358 million. So that is an enormous cut to our current budget. It's also very difficult because even as hard as it will be to figure out how to balance, what's even more challenging is the obvious that that's a $20 million range for us. And so either end of the range will be extremely difficult, but to have enough planning in place so that we can prepare for the whole range is going to be probably the most challenging work that I've ever seen in my career. An example, now I'm not recommending, we are not recommending that we do these. These are simply examples to try to help people kind of wrap their minds around the enormity of that large of a shortfall. So if you were to say, what if you balanced the shortfall simply by cutting days out of the working calendar, that would mean that we would be cutting 25 days, 25 school days. We're not going to recommend that, but we just wanted to make sure people knew you can't solve this problem simply by shortening the work year. Or people might say, well, why don't you just eliminate some positions? And we wanted you to understand that the number of positions would be huge. And we just picked teaching positions, again, as an example. We would never recommend that you balance a budget this way. But just so you'll know, it would be 375 teaching positions. Okay? Obviously, these would not be recommendations. They're meant just to help people understand the enormity of the problem. It also helps just to have a brief refresher and reminder about our current budget. So this is for this school year. And I think the main point on here is to remind people that we have 84% of our budget in people. It is a people-intensive business. That is a very typical pie chart for running a public education system, or actually any education system in our nation. It's a people-intensive business. So when the cuts become enormous, there is a very small amount of that pie chart that you can actually eliminate in terms of purchase power. We also wanted people to remember that we do have the majority, well, yes, the majority of our budget, as it should be, in licensed staff. We put most of our focus on our teaching force, and that's the way it should be. We also have a significant amount of our focus on our classified workforce who support our teachers, our students, and our administrators.